Brother-in-law wore a copy of my wedding dress, announced a fake pregnancy with my wife's name on it. Then my dad stood up and destroyed him. Entire fantasy in front of everyone. My brother-in-law wore a copy of my wife's wedding dress, announced a fake pregnancy with my wife's name on it. Then my dad stood up and destroyed his entire fantasy in front of everyone. My brother-in-law wore a copy of my wife's wedding dress to my mother's 60th birthday party. Same ivory lace, same sweetheart neckline, same low bun with the same loose curls Gwen wore on June 3rd, 2022. Nobody said anything at first. We told ourselves it was a coincidence. Quick pause before we get into it. If stories like this are your thing, go ahead and hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Now, back to the story. Trevor stood up at the head of the table, cake in his hand, and asked for silence. "I have something important to say," he said. He set the knife down. He pulled a folder out of his bag, printed pages, screenshots, dozens of them, texts between him and my wife, messages dated for nights Gwen and I were in Charleston for our anniversary, messages dated for a weekend we spent in Michigan visiting her parents. He read them out loud, one by one, in a voice that shook just enough to sound real. "I love you too. I can't stop thinking about you. I'll tell him soon." Gwen never wrote those words. Not to him, not to anyone. My sister Olivia sat frozen next to him, her fork halfway to her mouth, not moving. Then Trevor reached back into his bag and pulled out a pregnancy test. "She's carrying my baby," he said. "We've been together 2 months. I can't hide it anymore." 12 people sat around that table. Nobody breathed. I looked at Gwen. She wasn't looking at Trevor. She was looking at me, and her face had the specific blankness of a woman watching her own life get rewritten in real time. My father, Dean, was sitting at the far end of the table, still holding his fork. He set it down slowly, the way he used to set things down right before he told my sister and me we were in real trouble as kids. Then, before anyone else could speak, before Olivia could ask a single question, before my mother could stand up from her own birthday chair, my father started laughing. Not a nervous laugh, not a polite cough of disbelief, a real laugh, loud enough to bounce off the dining room windows, loud enough that my uncle actually flinched. Trevor's face froze mid-performance. The test was still in his hand. My father pushed his chair back and stood up. To understand what happened in the next 4 minutes in that dining room, and how a 62-year-old retired nurse in a cardigan ended up taking apart a story that had already convinced my own sister, I have to go back to a Tuesday night in July before any of us knew Trevor's name. I was 31 that summer. Gwen and I had been married 2 years and together for 5. We lived 20 minutes from my parents in a rented duplex on Kessler Boulevard, close enough that I still had dinner at their house most Sundays, the way I had my whole life. My sister Olivia was 28, 3 years younger than me, and she'd never dated anyone longer than 8 months. It wasn't that she was reckless. She fell fast and hard every time, decided within weeks that this was the one, and then watched it fall apart just as fast when the person turned out to be, in her words, not who I thought. My father used to joke that Olivia fell in love the way other people caught colds, suddenly and always at the worst possible time. She met Trevor Voss at a work conference in Cincinnati in June 2024. He sold medical equipment for a company out of Columbus. She texted our family group chat that night, "Met someone incredible, don't laugh at me." We laughed anyway. It was a running joke by then. 3 weeks later, she brought him to Sunday dinner. My parents' house on Larchmont Drive hadn't changed since I was a kid. Same yellow kitchen, same oak table my mom built the year I was born, same chipped mug collection above the sink. My father had spent 34 years as an ER charge nurse at Miami Valley Hospital before retiring the year before, and he still ran a room the way he'd run a trauma bay, calm, watching everything, missing nothing. Trevor arrived in a crisp white shirt holding a bottle of wine he'd clearly picked because the label matched the flowers he'd also brought. He was warm at first, complimented my mother's kitchen, asked her about her woodworking, laughed at Olivia's jokes a beat too early, like he'd already decided how the night would go. Then Gwen walked in from the driveway, back from parking the car, and something in his face changed. He stood up before Olivia could introduce him, walked straight to Gwen, shook her hand, and held it a second too long. "Nice to meet Gwen's current husband," he said, looking at me while he said it. "I'm Trevor, her future." I laughed because it sounded like a joke, the kind of overconfident bit some people do to seem funny at a first dinner. Gwen laughed too, said something like, "Good to know," and pulled her hand back. Olivia didn't laugh. She looked at him confused and said, "That's not, he's kidding," in the voice of someone trying to convince herself first. Trevor just smiled and patted her forearm, the way you'd calm down an anxious dog. "Relax," he said. "I'm funny." Nobody brought it up again. That's the part I think about now. How easily an entire family can decide, together and without discussing it, to pretend something didn't happen. The rest of that dinner, I watched him orbit my wife without seeming to. He served her first, every course, before Olivia or my mother or anyone else at the table. When my mother mentioned her tomato plants, Trevor turned to Gwen and asked if she liked working with her hands. When I tried to tell Gwen about a client call I'd had that week, I managed a dental office in Beaver Creek. Nothing exciting, but it was mine to talk about. Trevor cut across the table with a question for her about her gym schedule. I mentioned it to Gwen in the car on the way home. She shrugged it off. "He's new," she said. "People get weird trying to impress a whole family at once." I wanted to believe that. I'd wanted a lot of things to be true that year that weren't. left. There was one more moment from that first summer worth mentioning now, though it meant nothing to me at the time. In early August, 3 of us, me, Olivia, and Trevor, were waiting outside a restaurant for a table, and Olivia ran back to the car for her wallet. Trevor and I stood alone on the sidewalk for maybe 90 seconds. He was scrolling his phone, not really talking to me, and then he said, almost to himself, "My ex tried to say I was obsessive. She got some restraining order thing. It was so dramatic. Some women just can't handle a man who knows what he wants." He laughed when he said it. I laughed too, a little, because that's what you do when someone hands you something ugly wrapped in a joke. You hand it back the same way, so nobody has to look at it directly. I didn't tell Gwen. I didn't tell my father. It felt like nothing. A stray comment from a man I'd met twice. I filed it away in the part of my brain where you keep things that don't fit yet, and I forgot about it almost immediately. I think about that 90 seconds on the sidewalk more than almost anything else from that year now. Not because I could have stopped what came after. I don't think I could have, but because it was the only time Trevor ever told us the truth, and he only did it because he assumed I was too unimportant to matter. Olivia and I had always been close, closer than most siblings I knew growing up. Our parents worked opposite shifts most of my childhood. My mother drove a delivery route for a regional grocery distributor. My father worked nights at the hospital, and for a few years in elementary school, Olivia and I were each other's afternoons. I made her grilled cheese. She let me pick the TV shows. When I got married, she stood up during the toast and said I'd been raising her since she was 4, which made my father laugh so hard he had to leave the room. That closeness is part of why, looking back, I understand why she fell for Trevor the way she did, and why the rest of us took so long to say anything out loud. Questioning him felt like questioning her, and questioning her felt like questioning 28 years of trusting her judgment more than almost anyone else's. There was a family trip to a rented lake house in Salina, Ohio, the second weekend of August. 6 of us, my parents, Olivia and Trevor, Gwen, and me. It should have been an easy weekend. Instead, I remember a specific hour on the dock late in the afternoon, when Trevor asked Gwen to help him steady a paddleboard because Olivia wasn't strong enough to hold it right. Loud enough for Olivia to hear from 10 feet away. Olivia laughed it off. Gwen, uncomfortable, offered to grab my father instead. Trevor's smile flickered just slightly before he recovered it. My father watched the whole exchange from a lawn chair without saying a word. He told me months later that was the moment he started paying real attention, though he didn't write anything down yet. He said it took him a few more weeks to trust that what he was seeing wasn't just an overprotective parent inventing a problem out of a son-in-law he hadn't warmed to yet. Gwen, for what it's worth, was never the kind of woman any of this should have been able to attach itself to. She'd worked as a structural engineer at Torrance Structural for 6 years by then, the sort of job that rewards exactly the qualities she had naturally: patience, precision, an allergy to drama. She double-checked load calculations for a living. She was, before that August, the least eventful part of my entire family, in the best possible sense of the word. I think that's partly why Trevor chose her instead of finding some flaw to manufacture in me. A steady, quiet woman is easier to build a fantasy around than a man standing right next to her who might ask a direct question. By September, 3 months in, Olivia was telling my father she thought Trevor might be the one. My father, who had heard some version of that sentence from Olivia 4 times in 6 years, said what he always said, "Give it time, honey," and went back to his garden. None of us knew yet that the version of Trevor we'd met at that first dinner, warm and a little intense and eager to impress, was the best version we would ever see. The gym came first. Gwen worked out at the Anytime Fitness on Wilmington Pike at 6:30 every morning before her shift at Torrance Structural. She'd gone at that exact time for 4 years. In the 3rd week of August, Trevor joined. Not the location near his apartment in Beaver Creek, 20 minutes the other direction, the one 20 minutes from him and 4 minutes from her. He never approached her. That was the trick of it. He'd be on the treadmill facing her usual squat rack or stretching by the water fountain she always used, always positioned so she'd have to walk past him, always looking a little surprised to see her every single morning for 2 weeks straight. Gwen mentioned it to me almost as a joke at first. "Your future brother-in-law is really committed to fitness lately." Then it stopped being funny. She started varying her workout time. He adjusted with her. She switched locations for a week. He found the new one within 4 days. I asked Olivia about it at a cookout in early September, trying to keep my voice light. "Is Trevor working out near Gwen's gym a lot?" Olivia frowned. "He said he just likes that location. It has better equipment." I didn't push. I told myself maybe it was true. Then came the coffee shop. Gwen stopped every morning at Ghost Light Coffee downtown, a 5-minute walk from her office, for the large black coffee she'd ordered from the same barista for 3 years. In the 2nd week of September, Trevor started showing up, alone, every morning. He'd sit at the corner table by the window, the one with a clear line of sight to the counter, and he'd stay there, not working, not on his phone most of the time, just watching until she left. She told me about it the first day, uneasy but trying to laugh it off. By the 4th day, she wasn't laughing. "He doesn't even work downtown," she said. "His office is in Polaris. That's 40 minutes away." I called my father that night finally and told him what was happening. He listened the way he used to listen to a patient describe symptoms that didn't add up to any diagnosis he recognized yet. Quiet, careful, filing away every detail. "Keep track of dates," he told me, just in case. I didn't know yet that he'd already started doing the same thing. The texts started the following week. Trevor got Gwen's number from Olivia's phone. He told Olivia he needed it for a surprise he was planning for Gwen's birthday, which wasn't for another 4 months. She gave it to him without thinking twice. Why wouldn't she? He was her boyfriend. Family shared things like that. I've thought a lot since then about how ordinary that request must have sounded to my sister in the moment. How small. Someone you love asks for a phone number so he can plan something kind for someone else you love, and there is no version of that sentence, spoken out loud on a normal weeknight, that sets off any alarm at all. That was the thing about him I understood too late. He never asked for anything that couldn't be explained. He built the whole structure out of reasonable requests, one plank at a time, until he was standing somewhere he had no business being, and every board under his feet had been handed to him willingly. The first message was small. Good morning. Hope work isn't too crazy today. Gwen didn't respond. She showed it to me over breakfast, holding the phone at arm's length like it might be warm to the touch, and I remember telling her it was probably nothing, probably a wrong number, probably some crossed wire in a group thread she'd been added to by accident. I said the sorts of things you say when you want a small, strange thing to stay small. The next one came 4 hours later. Did you eat lunch? You never take care of yourself. That one landed differently, and we both knew it, because it wasn't the message of a stranger. It was the message of someone who had been watching closely enough to build a theory about her, who had decided she was a person who forgot to eat, who skipped meals when work got heavy, and who wanted her to know he'd noticed. It was intimate in a way that had nothing to do with intimacy. Then, that night, I know you feel something too. You don't have to pretend with me. I want to be clear about how those messages read at the time, because from the outside, I know it sounds like the kind of thing you laugh off. 3 texts from a man who barely knew her, but there was a quality to them I still don't have a clean word for. They weren't asking for a response. They didn't want a conversation. They were statements delivered into her life the way you'd nail a notice to a door, and the confidence in them was the part that made the back of my neck go cold. I know you feel something too. Not, do you? Not, I think. He wasn't testing a hypothesis. He was informing her of a reality he had already decided was true, and the fact that she had never said a word to encourage it, had in fact barely spoken to him beyond the polite minimums of family dinners, didn't seem to enter into his math at all. That was the first time I felt genuinely afraid, sitting on our bed reading a phone screen at 11 o'clock at night, because I understood that we were not dealing with a man who wanted something from Gwen and might be talked out of it. We were dealing with a man who believed something about Gwen, and belief doesn't listen to evidence the way wanting does. She blocked the number that night, told me about it right away, showed me the screenshots before she deleted them. The two of us sitting on our bed at 11 cow at night trying to figure out what to do with information that felt too small to act on and too strange to ignore. That's the specific trap of the whole thing, the one I'd warn anyone about if they asked. Every single piece of it, taken by itself, was too minor to bring to anyone. What were we going to do? Call Olivia and tell her that her boyfriend of 3 months had sent Gwen a text asking if she'd eaten lunch? We'd have sounded insane. We'd have sounded like the cold, suspicious family he was already, though we didn't know it yet, describing us to be. So we did the thing that felt proportionate to the size of the offense, which was to block him and say nothing and hope it was over. I understand now that hoping it was over was exactly the response he was counting on. He knew the messages were small. He knew we'd feel ridiculous escalating over something so small. The smallness wasn't a limitation of his approach. The smallness was the approach. 3 days later, a new number. Similar messages, softer, more careful, like he'd learned something from the block and was testing a gentler approach. This one didn't open with a declaration. It opened with a question about a restaurant. Someplace downtown he claimed to have heard she liked, asking if she'd recommend it, as though they were 2 friendly acquaintances catching up. If you didn't know it was him, if you hadn't seen the first 3, you'd have read it as completely benign. That was the point. He was sanding the edges off. He'd taken the block as data, the way a man testing a lock takes a failed key as data, and he'd come back with something that wouldn't trip the same wire. She blocked that one too, but I could see it was starting to wear on her in a way the first hadn't, because the first had felt like a fluke, and the second felt like a pattern, and a pattern is a thing that has decided about you. A week after that, a third, then a fourth. Each one arrived from a number neither of us recognized, each one pitched a little differently, as if he were running through a catalog of tones to find the one that would finally get an answer. One was warm. One was almost businesslike, referencing something about her firm, some project he'd apparently read about as though he were a colleague reaching out. One, the one that frightened her most, was concerned. It asked if she was okay. It said she'd seemed tense at the lake house and he just wanted to make sure she was all right, and it was signed for the first time with a name that wasn't his real one and wasn't Trevor either, just a single letter, and I remember Gwen staring at that letter for a long time before she blocked the number, because a fake name is a decision. A fake name means the person has thought about being caught and has planned around it. By the 1st of October, 6 different numbers had reached out to my wife, and 6 times she had said nothing back and blocked every single one. I keep coming back to the discipline of it, if that's the right word for something so sick. 6 numbers over roughly a month, spaced out, varied, never repeating the same mistake twice. That isn't the behavior of a man overcome by feeling. Overcome men are sloppy. They send 20 messages in a row at 2 in the morning and regret it by breakfast. This was patient. it. This was a man managing a project on a timeline, adjusting his methods based on results, and the coldness underneath the warmth of the words was the thing that told me, if I'd been willing to hear it, exactly who we were dealing with. She never told him she was married. She never had to. He'd been sitting across from me at my own parents' table the night Gwen introduced herself as my wife, on the night he called me her current husband. That's what I couldn't get past in those weeks when I was still trying to build an innocent explanation out of the pieces. There was no misunderstanding available to him. He hadn't wandered into some ambiguous situation and misread a signal. He had been in the room. He had shaken her hand and mine in the same 60 seconds. He had used the word husband about me, out loud, to my face, and turned it into a joke about the future. And everything he did after that, he did with full knowledge of exactly what he was reaching for and exactly whose it was. It wasn't confusion. It was appetite dressed up in the language of confusion, and I think part of why it took our whole family so long to see it plainly is that appetite that patient doesn't look like appetite. It looks like devotion, and devotion is the one thing nobody in a decent family wants to be caught punishing. The confrontation with Olivia happened on October 9th, a Wednesday at 9 at night. She showed up at our house without calling first, which she'd never done, not once in 28 years. That detail mattered more than almost anything else that night because Olivia was a caller. She called before she came over. She called before she left the store to ask if we needed anything. She was raised the way I was raised, by a father who thought showing up unannounced was a small rudeness you didn't do to people you respected, and in 28 years I could not remember a single time she had stood on my step without warning me first. So when I heard the knock and opened the door and found her there with no text ahead of it, I already knew, before she said a word, that something in her had come loose. I opened the door, and she was standing there with her jaw tight, the way she used to look right before she'd lose a fight she'd started with someone bigger than her in high school. She had that look on her a lot as a kid, the look of someone who had already committed to a position she was beginning to suspect was wrong and had decided to go down swinging anyway. "I need to talk to Gwen," she said. Now. Gwen came to the door. She'd heard the knock from the kitchen, and she came out drying her hands on a dish towel, and I watched her read Olivia's face in about half a second and set the towel down on the arm of the couch, the way you put down anything you're holding when you realize you're going to need both hands. Olivia didn't wait to be invited in. "Trevor told me you've been texting him," she said, "for weeks. He's been trying to tell you to stop, and you keep finding new ways to reach him." There it was, turned completely inside out. Every true thing about the last month reversed. The pursuer made the pursued. The one who had blocked 6 numbers recast as the one who couldn't stop reaching out. And the thing that took my breath was how thoroughly he'd done it, because Olivia wasn't reciting a vague suspicion. She was reciting a case. He'd given her weeks, and finding new ways to reach you and trying to tell you to stop, which meant he'd built a whole narrative with a beginning and a shape, and a wronged party at the center of it, and the wronged party was him. He'd taken the exact facts of what he had done to Gwen and handed them to my sister with the names switched, and because she loved him, and because she'd never had any reason in 28 years to think her own sister-in-law was a liar, she'd swallowed it whole. I watched my wife's face go somewhere very still and very tired. I'd only seen that particular stillness on her a handful of times, and every time it had been the moment she stopped being surprised by something and started being certain about it. "Olivia," she said, "I have never texted Trevor once in my life. He showed me the messages, Gwen. I've seen them." And I believe she had. I believe he'd sat her down and scrolled through a phone full of messages, and I believe every one of them looked real, because he'd have written both sides of the conversation himself, the way he wrote both sides of everything. "Then he showed you something he wrote himself." Gwen's voice didn't rise. That was always her way. The angrier she got, the quieter she sounded until you had to lean in to hear her. And there was something about that quiet that always landed harder than volume ever could, because you couldn't argue with it. There was nothing to push against. "Come inside. I'll show you my phone." Olivia followed her in, arms crossed, already building the argument she planned to have. I could see her doing it, could see her lining up the rebuttals, getting ready for Gwen to deflect or minimize or turn it around, because that's what you brace for when you've decided in advance that someone is guilty. You don't come ready to be shown you were wrong. You come ready to catch them in it. Gwen sat down at the kitchen table and opened her phone. She didn't perform anything. She didn't launch into a defense. She just handed my sister the actual record and let it speak, which was the most Gwen thing she could possibly have done, because Gwen had spent 6 years trusting that facts, laid out clearly enough, would win on their own, and she was about to find out over the next month how often that turns out not to be true, but it was true that night. And for the next 10 minutes, she walked my little sister through 6 blocked numbers, 41 messages she'd never answered, and a call log with 0 outgoing contact of any kind toward any of those numbers ever. That was the part that couldn't be argued with, and Gwen knew it, and she made sure Olivia saw it. Not just the messages, the absence, the nothing. 41 incoming and 0 outgoing, 6 numbers blocked, and not one of them ever dialed, called, texted back, or answered in any way. Across the entire span of weeks, he'd described her as chasing him. You can fake a conversation if you write both halves. You cannot fake the shape of a call log on someone else's actual phone, the empty outgoing column, the little block symbols marching down the screen, the timestamps that don't lie. Olivia went quiet. She scrolled through it herself, thumb moving slower and slower, her face changing the way a sky changes before rain, not all at once, in stages. The bravado went first, then the certainty, and what was left underneath was something I didn't want to watch, because it was the face of a person realizing she'd been made a fool of by someone she'd been getting ready to build a life with. "He said you'd deny it," she said finally, very quietly. And that sentence told me more about how deep it went than anything else she said, because it meant he'd preloaded her against the truth. He'd known this moment might come. He'd known Gwen might one day sit Olivia down and show her a clean phone, and he'd inoculated her ahead of time, told her the denial was coming, told her a clean phone would be part of the trick. He said you were good at covering things up. Olivia, look at the dates. Look at the timestamps. I was at your parents' lake house for 3 of these. You were standing next to me, and that was the one that couldn't survive contact with her own memory, because Olivia had been there. She'd stood on that dock. She'd watched Gwen the whole weekend, close enough to reach out and touch her, and now she was being asked to believe that during that same weekend, Gwen had been carrying on some secret correspondence with the man Olivia was sleeping next to. The math didn't just fail. It failed inside her own recollection, in a place he couldn't reach to edit. Olivia didn't say anything else. She stood up, put her phone in her pocket, and left without another word, the screen door banging shut behind her the way it always did. I've heard that screen door bang 10,000 times in my life, growing up 2 streets over, and I'd never once heard it sound the way it sounded that night, though of course it sounded exactly the same, and it was only me who'd changed. She didn't call me for 11 days after that. 11 days of silence from a sister who called me about nothing, about everything, about the weather and her lunch, and a song she'd heard in the car. I understood even then what the silence was. It wasn't anger at me. It was the sound of a person trying to hold 2 irreconcilable things in her head at the same time, the clean phone and the man she loved, and not being able to look at either of us while she did it. The dress happened somewhere in the middle of all of it, and it was the piece none of us noticed until it was already too late to matter. Back in August, before the gym, before the coffee shop, Trevor had asked me for photos from my wedding. I want to be precise about how that request came, because it's the part I've replayed more than any other. It wasn't strange when it happened. It arrived wrapped in exactly the kind of tenderness that makes a request impossible to refuse. He said he wanted inspiration for someday, that Olivia was different from his past relationships, that he could picture his own wedding for the first time in his life. He said it a little shyly, the way a man says a thing he's slightly embarrassed to admit he's been thinking about, and God help me, I was moved by it. My sister had spent 6 years falling in and out of love with people who never stayed, and here was a man telling me, her brother, that she was the one who'd finally made him imagine a future, and he wanted to see what a good wedding looked like, and would I mind? I didn't mind. I was glad. I remember feeling glad. I sent him a folder, 40 photos, Gwen's dress, her hair, her earrings, the small pearl drops that had been her grandmother's, her bouquet, the vineyard outside Yellow Springs where we got married on June 3rd, 2022. He thanked me, said the photos were so helpful. He even sent a little follow-up a day later, some comment about how beautiful the venue was, asking whether it had been hard to book, and I answered him, and I felt useful, and the whole exchange filed itself away in my memory as one of the small, ordinary kindnesses of having a new person joining the family. That's what makes it unbearable to think about now. Not that he tricked me, that he made me feel good while he did it. He let me hand him the blueprint, and then thanked me warmly enough that I walked away from the conversation feeling closer to him. That dress mattered to us more than I usually let on. Gwen's grandmother, her mother's mother, had died in the spring of 2020 before the wedding, and the earrings Gwen wore that day, small pearl drops her grandmother had worn at her own wedding in 1961, were the only piece of her Gwen had on her when she walked down the aisle. Gwen doesn't talk about her grandmother much, because Gwen doesn't talk about the things that hurt her much, but I know what that day meant to her, and I know what it meant that when she reached up during the ceremony to touch her ear, she was touching something her grandmother had touched 60 years earlier on the same kind of day. There is a version of a wedding dress that is just fabric, just an expensive thing you wear once, and then there is the version Gwen wore, which was a whole line of women stretching back behind her, and the difference between those two things is invisible in a photograph. You can send someone 40 pictures of it and they will see only the first kind, the fabric, the object, the costume, if that's all they're capable of seeing. I hadn't thought sending those 40 photos that I was handing anyone a blueprint. I thought I was sharing something good, the way you do with family. It didn't occur to me that a person could look at photographs like that and see a costume to be built, rather than a day that had already happened to someone else. And I think that's the real distance between us and him, the thing that made him so hard to see coming. We looked at that day and saw something that had happened. He looked at it and saw something that could be taken, not the meaning of it, which he couldn't take, which nobody could, but the shape of it, the surface, the lace and the neckline and the pinned up hair, all the parts that could be measured and ordered and reproduced by someone in another state, working from a set of reference images. He wanted the picture of the thing so badly that he was willing to counterfeit the picture, and it never seems to have crossed his mind that the picture was the least of it, that what he was actually chasing was something something that had never been for sale. By then, my father had started his notebook. He never told any of us. He'd started it the same week I called him about the coffee shop. Dates, locations, every detail Gwen or I mentioned to him in passing, written down in a dollar store notebook he kept in the pocket of his cardigan because some part of him had already understood faster than the rest of us that we were going to need it. I think about that a lot, the fact that he started writing before any of us knew there was anything to write down. He'd spent 34 years in an emergency room learning to trust the feeling that came before the diagnosis, the itch at the back of the mind that says the numbers on this chart don't add up even though I can't yet say why, and he'd learned not to wait for the itch to justify itself before he started paying attention. So, while the rest of us were still explaining things away, still building innocent stories, still telling ourselves it was probably nothing, my father was quietly keeping a record in a $1 spiral notebook because his hands had started doing the thing his training told them to do before his conscious mind had caught all the way up. He didn't announce it, he didn't warn us, he just wrote and waited and let the pattern accumulate on the page where it couldn't be argued with later. Trevor didn't disappear after the confrontation, he recalibrated. That was the word my father used later, and it was the right one, because Trevor never fought a thing he couldn't win. When one approach stopped working, he didn't double down on it. He abandoned it and opened a new front. The confrontation with Gwen's phone had failed, so he stopped trying to sell Olivia the story of Gwen the pursuer, at least directly, and he started working on all of us from the sides instead. He called my father twice crying, saying that Gwen and I were clearly threatened by how serious things had gotten with Olivia, that we'd always resented her finding someone who really loved her. It was a good story, in the way all his stories were good, because it took a real thing and poisoned it. It was true that Olivia had never had a relationship last. It was true that we worried about her. And he took that true worry and reframed it as resentment, as a family so used to Olivia's failures that we couldn't stand to watch her succeed. And if you didn't know him, if you were just a man on the other end of a phone listening to someone cry, it would have sounded plausible. Families are like that sometimes. Everyone knows a family like that. He was betting my father wouldn't be sure his wasn't one. My father listened both times without interrupting, said almost nothing, and wrote down the date and the content of both calls in his notebook the second he hung up. That was his method, and I didn't fully appreciate it until it was all over. He didn't argue with Trevor. He didn't defend us or push back or try to correct the record, because he understood that arguing would only tell Trevor which of his lines had landed and which needed reworking. Instead, he gave him almost nothing, a few soft, neutral sounds, and I see, and that must be hard, the exact tone he'd have used with an agitated patient he didn't want to escalate, and then he hung up and turned the whole call into evidence. Every cry, every accusation, every date. He was building a file while Trevor thought he was building sympathy, and the beauty of it, if there's any beauty in something so grim, is that Trevor never suspected the quiet man in the cardigan of doing anything but listening. He told my Uncle Carl at a baby shower I didn't attend that he thought Gwen had some kind of obsession with younger men, and that he felt unsafe being near her at family events. Carl, who barely knew any of us that well, repeated it at the next family gathering as though it were established fact, and I spent 20 minutes I'll never get back explaining to a man I saw twice a year why my wife of 5 years was not a predator. That conversation is one of the ugliest memories I have from the whole business, uglier in some ways than the party itself, because at the party the truth was on the table and everyone could see it, and in Carl's version there was no truth to point at, just a feeling he'd caught from someone else and was now passing along like a cold. He wasn't cruel about it. That was almost worse. He said it the way you repeat any piece of family news, half concerned, mostly just filling the air, and I understood standing there that this was how the whole thing spread. Not through malice, but through the ordinary human habit of repeating what you've heard, and that Trevor had counted on exactly that habit when he chose to whisper his poison to the most talkative person in the family. He didn't need Carl to believe it deeply. He just needed Carl to say it once, in a room, and let the room do the rest. He told Olivia more than once that his family had never really accepted him, that we were cold to him from the start, and because Olivia loved him, and because loving someone makes you want to believe their pain is real, she started pulling back from us. That's the sentence I'd underline if I were teaching someone how this works. Loving someone makes you want to believe their pain is real. It's not a flaw. It's the opposite of a flaw. It's the best thing about people who love well. The reflex to take a beloved's hurt seriously, to grant it the benefit of the doubt, to feel it as your own. Olivia had that reflex more strongly than anyone I know, and he found it, and he wrapped his hand around it, and he used it to turn her against the people who'd loved her longest. She skipped 2 Sunday dinners in a row. 2. In our family, that was a language, and what it said was that she'd rather be nowhere than be somewhere she had to choose between him and us, and that the choosing had already started to go his way. When I called to check on her, she sounded tired in a way I didn't recognize. Not sleepy tired, worn. The tired of someone spending enormous amounts of energy holding a position that keeps trying to slip out from under her. He's not lying, Cole, she told me once before I'd said a word about him. That was the tell, though I didn't name it at the time. I hadn't accused him of anything. I'd called to ask how she was, and the first thing out of her mouth was a defense, which meant she was already having the argument in her own head, already answering charges nobody had made. And a person only does that when some part of them has begun to suspect the charges are true. I know you all think he is, but you don't see him when it's just us. And I've wondered since what she saw when it was just them. I believe her that she saw something. I believe there was a version of Trevor he showed only to her, gentle and unguarded and in love, because that was his most important performance, and he'd have saved his best work for the audience of one who mattered. The cruelty of it is that it was probably the most convincing thing he did, and it was aimed at the one person who could least afford to doubt it. I didn't argue with her. I'd learned by then, or was starting to learn, that arguing only drove her deeper into his corner, that every fact I pushed became a wall she defended, because defending him had become the same thing as defending her own judgment, and no one gives up their own judgment easily. So instead I asked her one question as calmly as I could manage. Has anything he's told you ever turned out to not be true? I asked it quietly, without heat, the way our father would have asked it, a real question and not a trap, and I watched it land somewhere she wasn't ready to let it. She didn't answer that one, not that night, and not for a long time after. But I think it stayed in her the way the coffee shop feeling had stayed in me back in July, lodged in the part of the mind where you keep the things that don't fit yet, waiting for the day the rest of the picture would arrive and give it a place to belong. In the last week of September, Trevor found a new way in. He added himself to the family group chat using Olivia's phone while she was in the shower, then made sure to mention it to her afterward so it wouldn't look like something he'd hidden. My father, seeing an unfamiliar number join a chat he'd curated for a decade, said nothing and wrote the date down. 4 days later, at 11 out at night, a message came through from that same number. Something's wrong. I think Olivia's losing the baby. She doesn't want to worry anyone. Can someone call me? My father, still a nurse in every instinct he had left, called immediately. Trevor answered, sounding breathless, described cramping and dizziness in enough clinical-sounding detail that my father, despite everything, felt his stomach drop with real concern. Have you called her OB? My father asked. Do you want me to drive over? No, please don't tell Olivia I told you. She doesn't want anyone to worry if it's nothing. My father sat up with him on the phone for 40 minutes that night, calm and steady. It was, he told me later, the single hardest night of the entire ordeal for him personally, because some part of him, the part that had spent 34 years believing patients when they described a body in trouble, wanted so badly for it to be a real crisis he could help with, and hated himself a little for the flicker of relief he felt. When by morning Trevor texted that everything was fine and asked everyone to please not make a big deal of it. There was no OB. There was no miscarriage. There was, as we learned much later from Fran Mescal's report, no pregnancy of any kind at any point that fall. What there was, my father came to understand only in hindsight, was a man testing exactly how far he could reach into a family's most protective instincts and pull them toward him, one fabricated crisis at a time, gathering data on who would come running and how fast. My father never mentioned that phone call to Olivia. He carried it alone for 6 weeks, until the folder Olivia brought to that diner off Woodman Drive finally gave him an answer he could act on. On October 19th, 10 days after the confrontation, Olivia drove to a strip mall office off East Stroop Road and paid a retainer of $850 to a private investigator named Fran Mescal. She told nobody, not Trevor, not my father, not me. She told me later that she almost didn't go through with it. She sat in the parking lot for 20 minutes before she made herself walk inside. Some part of her already suspected what she was about to find, and some larger, more stubborn part of her still hoped she'd walk out with nothing but a receipt and an apology to make to her own family. Olivia called me on October 25th and asked me to meet her alone, no Gwen, at a diner off Woodman Drive. She looked like she hadn't slept. She set a manila folder on the table between us and didn't say anything for almost a full minute. I need you to read this before I say anything, she said, because I don't think I can explain it right. I opened it. The first page was a summary from Fran Mescal dated October 24th. Subject, Trevor Voss. Current address in Beaver Creek, Ohio. Then a line that made the rest of the page blur for a second. Legal name of record, Mitchell Ryan Kern. Voss is a name, Olivia said. It's his mother's maiden name. He's used it since 2021. It's not illegal. That's not the part. I kept reading. The next page was a copy of a civil protective order filed in Richmond, Virginia in March 2022. Petitioner, Danielle Choi. Respondent, Mitchell Ryan Kern. The filing cited a pattern of contact after the end of a 2-year engagement. Messages sent from multiple numbers after being blocked. Appearances at Danielle Choi's workplace. And a claim made to Danielle's family at a holiday gathering that she was pregnant with his child. The filing noted that no pregnancy was ever medically confirmed, and that Kern later admitted in a recorded voicemail, included as an exhibit, that he had wanted it to be true so badly it felt true. I read that sentence 3 times. Before Danielle Choi, there had been someone else. Quick pause from the story. If you enjoy these stories, consider taking a listen to our Spotify show linked in the description for early access to new stories and better audio quality. Now, back to the video. Marissa Webb, Louisville, Kentucky, 2019 to 2020. No protective order that time. No No court filing, just a brother, Reese Webb, who Fran Mescal had tracked down and interviewed over the phone, who described almost exactly what our family had lived through that summer. The sudden appearance at Maurice's gym, the showing up at family dinners in clothes that mirrored her ex-boyfriend's, the claim of pregnancy made in front of extended family at Maurice's grandfather's 80th birthday party, followed 2 weeks later by a quiet admission that the baby had been lost. An admission nobody in that family had ever been able to verify one way or the other because there had never been a doctor's office, a due date, or a single piece of paper to back any of it up. "There's more," Olivia said, and her voice cracked on the word more in a way I'd never heard from her before. The last section of the report was financial. Fran Mescal had pulled a public records trail on a payment app and matched a $240 payment request from Trevor to a seller account called Threaded Elegance, dated August 14th, 6 days after I'd emailed him 40 photos from my own wedding. The memo line read, "Custom gown deposit. A follow-up payment, $98, cleared on September 2nd. Memo line, final balance, rush order." I did the math without wanting to. August 14th was after he'd asked me for wedding photos for inspiration. He hadn't waited to see how serious things got with my sister. He hadn't waited to see if there was even a wedding of his own on the horizon to plan for. He had ordered a copy of Gwen's dress before Olivia had said a single word about marriage. Before any of us had any reason to think this was anything more than a new boyfriend still learning how our family worked. Olivia put both hands flat on the diner table like she needed something solid to hold on to. "I keep trying to find the version of this where I misunderstood something," she said. "I can't find it. I didn't say I told you so." I thought about the sidewalk, though. The one where Trevor had laughed about his ex's restraining order thing. The one I'd filed away and forgotten because it seemed too small to matter. "What do you want to do?" I asked her. "I want to talk to him first," Olivia said. "Alone, before anybody else knows. I need to hear what he says when it's just us and there's nowhere to perform for." I understood that. I didn't love it, but I understood it. "Okay," I said. "But Olivia, Mom's birthday is in a week. If you haven't talked to him by then, I don't think we can sit at a table with him like nothing's happening." She said she understood. She said she'd handle it before November 2nd. She didn't get the chance. She tried twice that week. The first time, on October 28th, she drove to his apartment planning to lay the folder on his kitchen counter and ask him to explain himself. He met her at the door crying, said he'd had a rough day at work, and asked if they could just order food and not talk about anything heavy that night. She folded. The second time, on October 31st, she got as far as saying his name in a voice that made him go still. "Trevor, I need to ask you something." He cut her off before she finished the sentence, said he'd been feeling dizzy all week, said he was scared something might be wrong with the baby, and asked her to just sit with him instead of interrogating him right before a doctor's appointment he claimed to have scheduled for the following Tuesday. There was no appointment, there was no baby, but Olivia didn't know that yet, not with certainty, and so she sat with him instead, and the folder stayed in the trunk of her car. By the morning of November 2nd, my mother's 60th birthday, Olivia still hadn't said a word to him. She decided she would, quietly, after the party. One more day, she told herself. She didn't know yet that Trevor had decided the party would be the day too, that he'd read the same hesitation in her that I'd read in myself for months and had chosen to move first. 5'6", 62 years old. My father crossed that dining room like he owned every square foot of it, and Trevor, 26, half a foot taller, still wearing a dress cut from Gwen's own wedding photos, took a step backward without seeming to decide to. "I need to see that," my father said, and held out his hand. Trevor handed the test over before he'd even finished thinking about it. That's the kind of voice my father has when he wants something. 34 years of telling frightened families the truth in an ER hallway teaches you exactly how to sound like you're not asking. My father held the test up to the chandelier light and turned it slowly so the whole table could see what he was seeing. "This is still sealed in the wrapper," he said. "You can see the plastic edge catching the light in the reflection right there. You bought this on the way here tonight and didn't think anyone would look this closely. There was never a test because there was never anything to test." Trevor's mouth opened. Nothing came out. My father wasn't finished. He reached into the pocket of his cardigan and pulled out a small spiral notebook, the kind you buy for $1, and opened it to a page covered in his small, precise handwriting. "You've known my daughter for 18 weeks, he said. "You met Gwen 22 weeks ago right here in this house and told her you were her future while my son sat 2 feet away from you. Since then, you have shown up at her gym 11 times, her coffee shop 9 times, and her office parking lot twice. You have contacted her from 6 different phone numbers. I have every date written here next to every excuse you gave someone in this family for why you happened to be there." He set the notebook down on the table, open, facing Trevor. Like a hand of cards nobody was allowed to fold. Gwen stood up next. She didn't raise her voice. She never did. "I have location data going back to June," she said, and turned her phone around so my mother, sitting closest, could see the screen. "Every single date on those texts you just read out loud, I can show you exactly where I was. Charleston, Michigan, my own office, badged in at 8:03 a.m. Every single morning you claim I was texting you from a hotel room somewhere." She set the phone down next to the notebook. Olivia hadn't moved from her chair the whole time. She was staring at the table, at the notebook, at the phone, and I watched something in her finally give way completely. "What's going on?" she said, and her voice broke on the last word. She looked up at Trevor. What is going on? I don't think she was asking him anymore. I think she was asking all of us. And herself. And the last 3 months of her own life. That's when I saw it. The exact moment Trevor stopped performing. His face didn't crumble the way a genuinely caught person's face crumbles. It went flat, and then it went cold in a way that made the hair on my arms stand up even now thinking about it. You have no idea what I'm capable of, he said, quiet and even. Nothing like the trembling voice he'd used to read the fake texts 20 minutes earlier. None of you do. Then he smiled, a small, satisfied smile, and pulled out a second folder, thicker than the first. Fine, he said. You want to play it this way? He opened it and started pulling out photographs. Glossy, the kind you order from a drugstore kiosk. Pictures of him and Gwen close together at what looked like a restaurant, at what looked like a hotel hallway. For one horrible second, before my brain caught up with my eyes, I felt the floor tilt. Gwen picked one up, studied it for 2 seconds, and started laughing. Not cruelly, almost sadly. This is a stock photo, she said, turning it around so the table could see. You can see the watermark in the corner. You cropped it, but there's still a sliver of it right here, she pointed. And this is a photo of me from my company's LinkedIn page, from an event 2 years ago, spliced next to a picture of you. You can see the lighting doesn't match. You can see the shadow falls the wrong direction on your side. The room had gone so quiet, I could hear the air conditioning cycle on. There's more, Trevor said, and his voice had an edge to it now, something starting to fray. I have messages saved. I'll tell people what really happened. I'll tell people Mitchell. Olivia said it, just his name, his real name, the one none of us but her and I had heard yet, and something about the way she said it, flat and final, stopped him cold. That's not even your name, she said. Is it? Voss isn't your name. Kern is your name. Mitchell Ryan Kern. There's a protective order in Richmond, Virginia with your real name on it, filed by a woman named Danielle Choi in March of 2022, because you did this exact thing to her. The fake pregnancy, the showing up at her family's house, all of it. There's a man in Louisville who watched you do the same thing to his sister 3 years before that. She set her own folder down next to my father's notebook and Gwen's phone. I hired a private investigator 2 weeks ago. I've had this for 8 days. I wanted to talk to you alone first. I wanted to give you a chance to just tell me the truth. You had 8 days, Mitchell. You spent all of them lying to my face. For the first time since he'd stood up at the head of that table, Trevor didn't have anything to say. My mother, who had said almost nothing through her own 60th birthday party, finally stood up. She was a quiet woman by nature, but when she spoke now, her voice filled the whole space. I think it's time for you to leave, she said, not unkindly, just final, the way a door closes when there's nothing left to hold it open. He looked around the table one more time at my father, still standing with the notebook open in front of him, at Gwen, who had already sat back down, done with the whole performance, at Olivia, who wouldn't look at him at all now, at my Uncle Carl, who had gone pale. Whatever calculation Mitchell was running behind his eyes came up empty. He gathered the folder, the photographs, the sealed test, still on the table where my father had set it down, and walked out through the front hall without another word. I heard his shoes on the hardwood, then the front door, then nothing. Olivia sat back down across from the empty chair he'd occupied 20 minutes earlier, and put her head in her hands. My father walked over and put his palm flat on her back, the way he used to when she was small and had fallen off something she shouldn't have been climbing. Nobody touched the cake. My brother-in-law wore a copy of my wife's wedding dress to my mother's 60th birthday party. He spent $800, 3 states, and 2 other families building a day that was never going to belong to him, and my father took it apart in 4 minutes with a dollar store notebook and a pregnancy test that was still sealed in its wrapper. Gwen only ever wore that dress once, on June 3rd, 2022. He never got to wear a real one at all.